Hey guys. Tonight we're stepping into the opulent halls of the Forbidden City in Beijing, where silk curtains flutter gently in the morning breeze and incense burns lazily in golden braziers. You can almost hear the soft shuffle of silk slippers against polished marble floors, the distant chime of temple bells echoing across courtyards filled with blooming peonies. The air is thick with the scent of jasmine and the weight of centuries-old traditions, where power and protocol dance together in an endless, drowsy waltz. You're about to meet an emperor so committed to avoiding responsibility that he turned procrastination into an art form. And honestly, you probably won't survive the first 10 minutes of this story without your eyelids getting heavy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop that in the comments below. Now, let's find that cozy spot, pull a blanket around you, and gently drift into tonight's calm adventure. You find yourself transported to the year 1521, during the Ming Dynasty, where the morning sun filters through the intricate wooden lattice windows of the Forbidden City. The palace is stirring to life with the gentle sounds of servants preparing for another day of imperial ceremony. But in the most important chamber of all, the emperor's private quarters, there's nothing but the soft sound of steady breathing from beneath layers of the finest silk bedding. Emperor Zhengde, whose name ironically means correct virtue, is fast asleep at nearly noon. And this is not unusual. In fact, it's become so routine that the palace staff have developed an entire system of governance that operates around his love of slumber. You watch as eunuchs tiptoe past his chamber, carrying scrolls of urgent state business that will wait another day, another week, perhaps another month for the imperial seal. You drift closer to observe this most unusual ruler, and you notice how, even in sleep, he seems to radiate an almost supernatural ability to avoid responsibility. His face is peaceful, untroubled by the weight of ruling over 60 million subjects. His breathing is deep and rhythmic, like someone who has never lost a moment's sleep over matters of state, which, as you're about to discover, is quite literally true. The story of how Zhengde became the laziest emperor in Chinese history begins not with his birth, but with his childhood, when you would have found him in the very same palace, but as a young prince who showed an early and remarkable talent for creative procrastination. You see him as a boy of 8, sitting in his tutoring chamber while his Confucian teachers drone on about the responsibilities of rulership, the importance of virtue, and the sacred duty of the emperor to serve his people. But young Zhengde has discovered something far more interesting than governance. He's found that if he sits very still and breathes very quietly, he can actually fall asleep with his eyes open. His teachers, bound by protocol and respect for the imperial bloodline, cannot simply shake the future emperor awake. Instead, they continue their lessons to what appears to be an attentive student, never realizing that behind those dark eyes, Zhengde is dreaming of anything but statecraft. He dreams of games and adventures, of freedom from the suffocating weight of expectation that presses down on every imperial heir. You follow his journey through adolescence, watching as this skill develops into something approaching genius. By the time he's 14, Zhengde has mastered the art of the strategic nap. He can fall asleep during poetry recitations, wake up just long enough to nod at appropriate moments during military briefings, and then drift off again while his advisors debate the finer points of taxation policy. It's as if he's developed a sixth sense for detecting when someone might ask him to make an actual decision, The palace, you observe, begins to adapt around him like water flowing around a stone. The eunuchs learn to time their reports for those brief moments when the prince appears alert. The kitchen staff discovers that if they serve his meals at exactly the right temperature and sweetness, he's more likely to stay awake long enough to hear about pressing matters. The palace architects even begin designing spaces with more comfortable seating, as if acknowledging that their future ruler will spend most of his time in various states of repose. You watch as Zhengde's father, Emperor Hongji, grows increasingly concerned about his son's unusual approach to preparation for rule. Hongji is everything his son is not: diligent, conscientious, deeply committed to the welfare of his people. You see him pacing in his private study, scrolls of administrative business spread across his desk as he contemplates the challenge of preparing a chronically sleepy heir for the enormous responsibilities of the Dragon Throne. But Hongji, for all his virtues, makes a crucial miscalculation. He believes that responsibility will cure his son's lethargy, that the weight of actual power will awaken something serious and purposeful in the boy. He increases Zhengde's involvement in court ceremonies, assigns him more tutorials with learned scholars, and even begins bringing him to important policy meetings. The result, you observe with growing amusement, is not greater engagement, but rather more sophisticated sleeping techniques. Young Zhengde learns to sleep while standing during long ceremonial functions, developing a slight sway that palace observers mistake for deep contemplation. He masters the art of the meaningful nod that can be deployed at strategic moments to create the impression of attention. Most impressively, he develops what the eunuchs privately call imperial listening, a state where he appears to be absorbing every word while actually being completely unconscious of the conversation around him. You're present in the palace on that fateful day in 1505 when 18-year-old Zhengde officially becomes emperor. The ceremony is magnificent. Thousands of officials prostrating themselves, the air thick with incense and the weight of centuries of tradition. The young emperor sits perfectly still on the dragon throne, his face a mask of imperial dignity, and every person present believes they're witnessing the beginning of a new era of strong leadership. What they're actually witnessing, you realize, is the most elaborate nap in human history. Zhengde has learned to sleep with his eyes open so convincingly that even his closest advisors can't tell the difference between imperial contemplation and imperial unconsciousness. As the ceremony proceeds, lasting over 4 hours, the new emperor maintains perfect posture and appropriate facial expressions while being completely asleep. It's a masterpiece of unconscious performance art. The real genius of Zhengde's approach to rule becomes apparent in his first months as emperor. You observe as he develops what historians will later call government by absence. Rather than fighting against his natural inclination to avoid responsibility, he embraces it completely and creates a system that turns his laziness into a form of political philosophy. The key insight, you realize, is that Zhengde understands something about power that more energetic rulers often miss. Sometimes the best way to maintain authority is to use it as little as possible. By sleeping through most meetings, he avoids making decisions that might anger powerful factions. By delegating everything to his advisors, he creates a buffer between himself and potential criticism. Most brilliantly, by being consistently unavailable, he makes his rare moments of attention seem precious and meaningful. You watch as the palace develops an entire ecosystem around the emperor's schedule of strategic unconsciousness. The Grand Secretariat, the highest administrative body in the empire, learns to function with minimal imperial input. They develop elaborate protocols for governance that assume the emperor will be unavailable for weeks at a time. Important decisions are made by committee, then presented to Zhengde in the simplest possible terms during his brief periods of wakefulness. The eunuchs, those powerful intermediaries between the emperor and his government, become masters of the 15-minute briefing. They learn to distill complex issues of state into digestible summaries that can be absorbed during the brief window between when Zhengde wakes up and when he falls asleep again. These briefings become legendary for their efficiency. Entire military campaigns planned and approved in the time it takes the emperor to eat a light breakfast. You observe the particularly ingenious solution the palace develops for the imperial seal, that crucial stamp of imperial approval required for all important documents. Since Zhengde is rarely awake and alert enough to carefully review documents before stamping them, the eunuchs create a system of color-coded summary tags. Green means routine administrative business that can be approved automatically. Yellow indicates issues that require brief imperial attention. Red signals matters that genuinely need the emperor to be fully conscious. The remarkable thing you notice is how rarely anything is actually marked red. The palace staff, now thoroughly adapted to their sleepy sovereign, become expert at handling crises through existing protocols and precedent. They discover that most problems that seem urgent at first can actually wait, and that many issues resolve themselves if left alone long enough. Zhengde's laziness, almost accidentally, creates a more stable and less reactive government. You follow the emperor through a typical day, starting around noon when he finally stirs from his bed. The morning sunlight, carefully filtered through silk screens to avoid being too harsh, gently illuminates his chambers as servants silently prepare his bath. The water is precisely the right temperature, not so warm as to make him drowsy again, but not so cool as to shock him into unwanted alertness. As Zhengde bathes, you notice the particular ritual that has developed around his morning routine. A eunuch sits nearby, reading in a soft, monotone voice from the previous day's reports. The emperor's eyes remain closed, and his breathing stays deep and regular, but occasionally he'll grunt or nod slightly, indicating some level of processing. These minimal responses are carefully noted and interpreted by the palace staff, who have become expert at reading the subtle signs of imperial attention. Breakfast is a carefully choreographed affair, designed to maintain Zhengde's delicate balance between sleep and wakefulness. The food is served in small portions to prevent the heavy feeling that comes with larger meals. The flavors are mild and comforting, nothing too spicy or stimulating that might jar him into unwanted alertness, nothing too bland that might lull him back to sleep. Even the dishes are chosen for their quiet preparation, no sizzling or chopping sounds that might disturb the emperor's peaceful state. During breakfast, the day's most important matters are presented to him through what the eunuchs have termed ambient briefing. Rather than formal presentations, information is woven into casual conversation around the emperor's table. A eunuch might mention, while discussing the weather, that the harvest reports from Shandong province are quite favorable this year. Another might observe, while commenting on the pleasant morning light, that the tribute delegation from Korea has arrived and is waiting for an imperial audience. Zhengde processes this information in his own unique way. He rarely responds directly to these casual mentions, but you notice that he seems to absorb the essential details. When pressed for actual decisions, he has developed a repertoire of responses that sound decisive while actually leaving all the real choices to his advisors. "Handle it with the usual wisdom" is a favorite phrase, as is "follow the established precedent" and the wonderfully vague "do what seems best for the empire." You observe the emperor's approach to formal audiences, which are scheduled for the early afternoon when he's theoretically at his most alert. The throne room is arranged to maximize his comfort. The dragon throne has been subtly modified with additional cushioning. The lighting is kept soft and warm, and even the acoustics have been adjusted so that speakers' voices have a gentle, almost hypnotic quality. The audiences themselves have evolved into a form of performance art. Officials approach the throne with their petitions and reports, speaking in the ritualized language of imperial protocol, while Zheng De maintains an expression of deep contemplation that could equally well be described as deep sleep. His responses, when they come, are delivered in the same measured, dreamlike tone that has become his signature style of leadership. You witness a particularly telling example when a delegation of military officials arrives to discuss border security along the northern frontier. The situation is potentially serious. Nomadic tribes have been making increasingly bold raids, and the local commanders are requesting additional troops and supplies. In a more conventional court, this would require detailed discussion of troop deployments, supply lines, and strategic objectives. But Shengdi has developed his own approach to military leadership. After listening to the briefing with his characteristic expression of serene inattention, he delivers one of his most quoted responses. "The empire has defended itself for 1,000 years through the wisdom of its generals and the virtue of its people. Continue to embody both." It's a response that sounds profound while saying absolutely nothing specific, leaving his commanders free to make their own decisions while creating the impression of imperial guidance. The genius of this approach becomes apparent when you consider the results. The military commanders, forced to take full responsibility for their decisions without being able to blame the emperor for poor choices, become more careful and thoughtful in their planning. The border situation is handled competently, not through imperial micromanagement, but through the professional competence of officers who know they can't rely on detailed instructions from above. You follow the emperor through his afternoon activities, which have been carefully designed to occupy his time without requiring sustained effort or attention. He has developed a love for watching palace artisans at work, activities that are visually engaging, but don't require his participation. You see him spending hours observing jade carvers, silk weavers, and calligraphers, his presence lending imperial dignity to their work, while demanding nothing from him but passive attention. These afternoon observations serve multiple purposes in Zhengde's system of governance. They allow him to stay technically busy and visible to the palace staff, maintaining the appearance of imperial engagement. They provide natural opportunities for informal conversations with craftsmen and minor officials, giving him a sense of palace life without the burden of formal meetings. Most importantly, they offer countless opportunities for strategic napping disguised as deep artistic appreciation. You notice how the palace artisans have adapted to their imperial audience. They've learned to work more quietly, reducing the hammering and scraping sounds that might disturb the emperor's concentration. They've developed a sense for when he's actually watching and when he's merely present, adjusting their pace accordingly. Some have even learned to provide gentle commentary on their work, creating a soothing audio backdrop that helps maintain Zhengde's optimal state of relaxed attention. The emperor's evening routine reveals perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of his approach to rule. Rather than formal state dinners or lengthy policy sessions, Zhengde has created what he calls ambient governance, informal gatherings where matters of state are discussed in the casual atmosphere of shared meals and entertainment. These evening sessions take place in the emperor's private dining hall, a more intimate space than the formal throne room. The lighting is provided by soft lanterns and candles, creating an atmosphere more conducive to relaxation than intense discussion. The seating is arranged to encourage informal conversation, with the emperor positioned so he can easily participate in discussions or retreat into quiet observation as his energy levels dictate. The conversations at these gatherings cover the full range of imperial business, but in a way that feels more like social chat than formal policymaking. An advisor might mention, while discussing the evening's entertainment, that the tax revenues from the southern provinces are running ahead of expectations. Another might observe, while commenting on the quality of the wine, that the diplomatic mission to Japan has returned with favorable terms for a new trade agreement. Zhengde's responses in these settings reveal the subtle intelligence behind his seemingly lazy approach to rule. While he rarely engages in lengthy discussions, his brief comments often cut to the heart of complex issues. When asked about a complicated dispute between provincial governors, he might simply say, "Let them work it out between themselves. They know their people better than we do." It's a response that sounds dismissive but actually reflects a sophisticated understanding of the limitations of central authority. You observe how this evening approach to governance creates a more collaborative atmosphere among his advisors. Without the formal hierarchy of daytime court sessions, officials feel freer to express different viewpoints and engage in genuine discussion. The emperor's relaxed presence encourages honesty and reduces the fear of imperial displeasure that can stifle good advice. Paradoxically, Zhengde's inattention creates space for better decision-making by those around him. The emperor's sleeping arrangements reveal the final piece of his system of strategic laziness. His bedchamber has been designed as the ultimate sanctuary from responsibility, a space so comfortable and conducive to rest that even thinking about state business becomes nearly impossible. The bed itself is a masterpiece of comfort engineering. Layers of silk mattresses and down quilts arranged to provide perfect support and temperature regulation. The room is kept in perpetual twilight, with heavy curtains blocking most natural light and soft screens diffusing what little illumination is allowed in. The air is kept fresh through an ingenious ventilation system that provides circulation without creating drafts. Even the sounds are carefully managed. The chamber is positioned away from the busiest parts of the palace, and the walls are thick enough to muffle most outside noise. You discover that Zhengde has developed a sophisticated understanding of sleep as a form of governance. He's learned that many problems that seem urgent at night appear more manageable in the morning, and that issues which demand immediate attention at the end of a long day often resolve themselves if left alone overnight. His commitment to adequate rest has inadvertently created a more measured and thoughtful approach to imperial decision-making. The emperor's sleep schedule also serves important symbolic functions in palace life. His early bedtime creates natural limits on evening activities, preventing the kind of late-night scheming and factional plotting that can destabilize imperial courts. His late morning rising establishes a rhythm that encourages deliberation over hasty action. Most importantly, His visible commitment to rest sets an example that helps prevent the burnout and exhaustion that can lead to poor judgment among his advisors. You witness the remarkable results of Zhengde's approach to rule as his reign progresses. The empire, rather than suffering from his lack of direct involvement, experiences a period of unusual stability and prosperity. The economy grows steadily, the borders remain secure, and the complex machinery of imperial administration functions smoothly without constant imperial intervention. The key to this success, you realize, lies in how Zhengde's laziness has forced everyone else in the government to become more competent and self-reliant. Knowing they can't depend on detailed imperial guidance, officials at every level have learned to make decisions based on established principles and precedent. The result is a more distributed and resilient system of governance that doesn't depend entirely on the energy and attention of a single individual. You observe how foreign diplomats and tribute missions react to the emperor's unique style of leadership. Initially, many are confused or even offended by his apparent lack of attention during formal audiences, but over time they begin to appreciate the deeper intelligence behind his approach. His brief, seemingly casual responses often demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of complex international relationships. A particularly telling example occurs when envoys from the Portuguese trading posts arrive, seeking expanded commercial privileges. In most imperial courts, such negotiations would involve lengthy formal discussions about trade routes, tariff schedules, and diplomatic protocols. But Zhengde's response is characteristically simple. Trade benefits all parties when conducted with mutual respect. Arrange the details with my ministers, but remember that friendship matters more than profit. The envoys initially interpret this as dismissive, but they gradually realize that the emperor has actually provided them with the fundamental principle they need to guide successful negotiations. His advisors, working within this framework, are able to craft agreements that benefit both Chinese and Portuguese interests precisely because they're not constrained by overly specific imperial instructions. You follow the emperor through the seasonal rhythms of palace life, noticing how his approach to governance adapts to the changing needs of different times of year. During the busy spring planting season, when agricultural reports and taxation issues demand attention, Zhengde maintains slightly longer periods of wakefulness, allowing more time for the economic briefings that affect millions of farmers across the empire. Summer brings the challenge of flood season and the complex logistics of disaster response. But rather than trying to micromanage relief efforts from the capital, Zhengde has established a system that delegates most emergency authority to provincial governors. His role becomes primarily symbolic, providing the imperial approval that legitimizes local response efforts while staying out of the way of people who actually understand local conditions. The autumn tribute season, when delegations from across the empire and beyond arrive at the capital, represents the peak of ceremonial demands on the emperor's time. But even here, Zhengde has found ways to maximize impact while minimizing effort. He appears at the most important ceremonies, but delegates most routine audiences to senior officials. His presence at key moments provides the imperial dignity these occasions require, while his absence from routine meetings allows him to maintain the energy needed for truly important encounters. Winter, traditionally the time for policy review and planning for the coming year, might seem to demand the most sustained attention from the emperor. But Zhengde has turned even this season to his advantage, using the longer nights and quieter pace to establish what he calls contemplative governance. Rather than lengthy policy sessions, he holds brief, informal consultations with his most trusted advisors, gathering the information he needs to make broad strategic decisions without getting bogged down in implementation details. You observe the emperor's relationship with the palace staff, who have developed an almost protective attitude toward their unusual sovereign. They take pride in their ability to maintain the empire's business while accommodating his unique working style. The eunuchs, in particular, have become expert at translating between the emperor's minimalist communication style and the detailed requirements of imperial administration. There's a touching scene you witness between Zheng Di and his longest-serving eunuch, a man named Liu Jin, who has been with the emperor since childhood. Liu Jin has learned to read the emperor's moods and energy levels with extraordinary precision, knowing exactly when to press for decisions and when to simply handle matters independently. Their relationship represents a perfect symbiosis. The emperor provides the authority and legitimacy that imperial decisions require, while Liu Jin provides the detailed attention and follow-through that effective administration demands. You see how this partnership handles a particularly complex crisis when flooding in the Yangtze River Valley threatens both lives and the rice harvest that feeds much of the empire. In a more conventional administration, such an emergency would require the emperor to chair lengthy crisis meetings, review detailed reports, and make numerous specific decisions about resource allocation and disaster response. But Zheng Da and Liu Jin have developed a more efficient approach. The emperor receives a brief morning briefing about the scope of the crisis, then makes a simple declaration: the people's welfare is the empire's first priority. Use whatever resources are necessary. Liu Jin, armed with this broad authorization, can then coordinate with provincial governors and military commanders to organize an effective response without needing constant imperial approval for specific actions. The result is a faster and more effective disaster response than might have emerged from more detailed imperial involvement. Local officials, knowing they have clear authority to act, can respond quickly to changing conditions. Resources are allocated based on actual need rather than bureaucratic protocol. Most importantly, the emperor's clear statement of priorities provides moral authority for difficult decisions about resource allocation without constraining responders with overly specific instructions. You follow the fascinating evolution of the imperial court under Zheng Di's influence. Traditional Chinese court culture emphasized elaborate ceremony, lengthy formal discussions, and complex hierarchical protocols, but the emperor's preference for informal interaction and his inability to maintain attention during long formal sessions gradually transforms palace culture in unexpected ways. Meetings become shorter and more focused, as officials learn that they have limited time to present their ideas before the emperor's attention wanes. This constraint, rather than hindering effective communication, actually improves it by forcing speakers to identify the most essential elements of complex issues. The ancient art of imperial briefing evolves toward greater clarity and conciseness. Formal ceremonies are streamlined to accommodate the emperor's limited tolerance for lengthy rituals, but rather than reducing their dignity or symbolic importance, this streamlining often enhances their impact by focusing attention on the most meaningful elements. A shorter ceremony that the emperor can participate in fully proves more impressive than a longer one where his attention clearly wanders. The palace social life also adapts to Zheng Da's preferences. with entertainment shifting toward forms that don't require active imperial participation. Music performances become more prominent, as the emperor can enjoy them while maintaining his preferred state of relaxed attention. Visual arts flourish as court painters and artisans create works that can be appreciated without demanding interaction or commentary. You witness the development of what court historians privately call the aesthetics of imperial leisure. Palace gardens are redesigned to provide more comfortable spaces for contemplation and rest. Architecture evolves toward creating environments that feel peaceful and restorative rather than imposing and demanding. Even court fashion adapts, with clothing becoming more comfortable and less constraining, allowing for the kind of relaxed posture that Zhengde prefers. The emperor's approach to military leadership reveals perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of his governing philosophy. Traditional Chinese imperial culture expected the emperor to be closely involved in military planning, to review battle reports in detail, and to make strategic decisions about troop deployments and campaign objectives. But Zhengde has discovered that his hands-off approach often produces better military outcomes than micromanagement from the capital. You observe a particularly illuminating example when nomadic raiders threatened the northern border provinces. The traditional response would involve the emperor reviewing detailed intelligence reports, consulting with military advisors about strategic options, and issuing specific orders about troop movements and engagement rules. Such a process might take weeks and could easily result in orders that are obsolete by the time they reach field commanders. Instead, Zhengde's response is characteristic in its simplicity. Protect the people and secure the borders using your best judgment. You have my complete confidence and all necessary authority. This message, delivered to the regional military commander, provides clear guidance about priorities while leaving tactical and strategic details to the people who best understand local conditions. The results exceed what anyone might have expected from more detailed imperial oversight. The field commander, knowing he has full authority and can't blame poor outcomes on inadequate instructions from the capital, develops a more creative and effective response to the threat. Rather than simply reacting to raids, he initiates diplomatic contact with tribal leaders, while simultaneously strengthening defensive positions and organizing local militia support. Within months, the border situation stabilizes through a combination of negotiated agreements with cooperative tribal groups and effective deterrence against hostile raiders. The emperor's minimal involvement, rather than representing neglect of his military responsibilities, has actually enabled more effective military leadership by removing the constraints and delays that can result from excessive central control. You follow the emperor through his relationship with the scholarly class, those Confucian intellectuals who traditionally serve as the empire's administrative backbone and moral guides. Initially, many scholars are troubled by Zhengde's apparent lack of engagement with the classical texts and philosophical discussions that they consider essential to good governance. They worry that an emperor who sleeps through poetry recitations and nods off during philosophical discussions cannot provide the moral leadership that Confucian political theory demands. But over time, a more sophisticated understanding emerges among the more thoughtful scholars. They begin to see that Zhengde's minimalist approach to rule actually embodies certain Confucian ideals in unexpected ways. His reluctance to make unnecessary interventions in his subjects' lives reflects the Confucian preference for governing through moral example rather than excessive regulation. His trust in his advisors demonstrates the kind of delegation that allows virtuous officials to exercise their talents fully. Most importantly, His consistent delegation of detailed administration to competent subordinates creates space for the kind of scholarly governance that Confucian theory envisions. Rather than competing with his advisors for control over policy details, Zhengde provides the legitimacy and authority they need, while leaving them free to apply classical principles to practical problems. You witness a particularly touching exchange between the emperor and his most senior Confucian advisor, a scholar named Wang Yangming, who has initially been frustrated by Zhengde's apparent lack of interest in philosophical discussion. Wang has requested a private audience to discuss his concerns about the emperor's governing style, expecting to deliver something approaching a lecture about imperial responsibilities. But the conversation takes an unexpected turn when Zhengde, speaking with unusual directness, explains his philosophy. A good emperor, like a good father, provides guidance and support without trying to live his children's lives for them. The empire has many capable people. My job is to create conditions where their capabilities can flourish, not to demonstrate my own cleverness by interfering with their work. Wang Yangming later writes that this brief conversation taught him more about practical governance. He comes to understand that Zhengde's approach, while unconventional, actually represents a sophisticated application of Confucian principles about the relationship between authority and wisdom. The emperor's handling of economic policy reveals another dimension of his leadership philosophy. Traditional imperial involvement in economic matters typically involved detailed regulations, complex taxation schemes, and frequent adjustments to commercial policies based on changing conditions. But Zhengde has developed what his advisors privately call economic minimalism, a hands-off approach that focuses on creating stable conditions for trade and agriculture while avoiding constant governmental tinkering. You observe the results of this approach during a period when several neighboring regions experience economic difficulties due to poor harvests and trade disruptions. The traditional imperial response might involve emergency taxation adjustments, new regulations on grain storage and distribution, and possibly even price controls to prevent speculation and hoarding. But Zhengde's response follows his characteristic pattern of providing clear principles while leaving implementation details to others. The people's welfare depends on fair trade and adequate food supplies. Remove any obstacles to both, and create incentives for merchants and farmers to serve the common good. His economic advisors, working within this framework, develop policies that reduce trade barriers, improve infrastructure for food distribution, and provide tax incentives for merchants who maintain adequate grain supplies in vulnerable regions. The economic results are remarkably positive. By avoiding the kinds of complex regulations that can create unintended consequences, the empire's economic response to the crisis is more flexible and effective than might have emerged from detailed imperial micromanagement. Merchants, confident that trade policies won't change randomly, make longer-term investments in supply networks. Farmers, knowing that they won't face sudden changes in tax obligations, are more willing to invest in productivity improvements. You witness the emperor's approach to one of the most challenging aspects of Chinese governance, managing the complex relationships between the central government and the empire's many provincial administrators. Traditional imperial practice required constant communication between the capital and the provinces, with detailed reporting on local conditions and frequent instructions from the center about policy implementation. But Zhengde has gradually developed a more decentralized approach that gives provincial governors significantly more autonomy while holding them accountable for results rather than compliance with detailed procedures. His appointments to provincial positions focus on finding capable administrators who can be trusted to operate independently, rather than selecting officials who will follow central instructions precisely. You observe the results of this approach when a dispute erupts between two provincial governors over water rights for a river that flows through both of their jurisdictions. In a more centralized system, such disputes would typically be resolved through lengthy appeals to the central government, with detailed investigations, formal hearings, and imperial judgments about technical matters that the emperor might not fully understand. Instead, Zhengde's response to the dispute is characteristically simple. Water, like wisdom, flows where it is needed most. Work together to ensure both provinces benefit, and remember that cooperation serves the empire better than competition. Rather than providing specific instructions about water allocation, he challenges the governors to find their own solution, while making clear that their success will be judged on their ability to collaborate effectively. The governors, realizing that they won't receive detailed guidance from the capital, are forced to engage in genuine negotiation and problem solving. They develop an innovative water sharing agreement that actually improves irrigation in both provinces, while creating a model for resolving similar disputes elsewhere in the empire. The emperor's refusal to micromanage the situation has enabled a more creative and effective solution than might have emerged from centralized decision-making. You follow the emperor through his relationship with the empire's religious and cultural institutions, observing how his approach to spiritual matters reflects the same minimalist philosophy that governs his political leadership. Traditional Chinese emperors were expected to play active roles in religious ceremonies, to make frequent pronouncements about moral and spiritual matters, and to demonstrate their virtue through visible participation in cultural activities. But Zhengde has developed what might be called spiritual delegation, recognizing that his role in religious matters is primarily symbolic while leaving substantive spiritual leadership to qualified religious professionals. His appearances at important religious ceremonies provide the imperial presence that legitimizes these occasions, while his minimal participation allows the focus to remain on spiritual rather than political matters. You witness a particularly illuminating example during the annual ceremonies honoring Confucius, traditionally an occasion for the emperor to demonstrate his commitment to scholarly values and moral leadership. In most imperial courts, such ceremonies would include lengthy imperial speeches about virtue and governance, detailed discussions of classical texts, and elaborate demonstrations of the emperor's own scholarly accomplishments. But Zhengde's participation is characteristically minimal yet meaningful. He appears at the ceremony in appropriate imperial regalia, performs the required ritual obligations with dignity and respect, and makes only brief remarks that focus on his gratitude for the wisdom of ancient sages rather than attempting to add his own philosophical insights. His presence legitimizes the ceremony while his restraint allows the focus to remain on the teachings being honored rather than on the emperor's own interpretations. The religious communities, initially uncertain about how to interpret the emperor's minimal involvement, gradually come to appreciate the wisdom of his approach. By avoiding the temptation to use religious occasions for political purposes, he preserves the spiritual integrity of these ceremonies while maintaining the imperial dignity they require. His respectful but limited participation allows religious leaders to focus on their spiritual responsibilities without being overshadowed by imperial personality or politics. You observe the emperor's handling of what might be the most challenging test of his governing philosophy, a serious crisis that threatens the stability of the empire itself. A combination of natural disasters, including floods in the south and drought in the north, creates conditions that could lead to widespread famine and social unrest. Such crises have historically been the moments when imperial leadership is most crucial, when detailed central coordination and decisive action can mean the difference between recovery and collapse. The traditional imperial response to such a crisis would involve the emperor taking personal charge of relief efforts, issuing detailed instructions to provincial officials, and demonstrating through visible activity that the imperial government is responding effectively to the people's needs. Failure to show such direct involvement could be interpreted as imperial neglect and could undermine the legitimacy of the dynasty itself. But Sungda's response, while initially concerning to his advisors, ultimately demonstrates the sophisticated wisdom behind his approach to leadership. Rather than trying to coordinate relief efforts personally, he immediately delegates full authority to his most capable officials, while making clear that they have unlimited resources and complete imperial support for their efforts. His public statement about the crisis is brief but powerful. The empire's strength lies in the competence of its officials and the resilience of its people. I have complete confidence in both, and they have whatever authority and resources they need to overcome these challenges. Rather than trying to appear personally heroic, he focuses attention on the people who will actually be doing the work of relief and recovery. The results vindicate his approach in dramatic fashion. Provincial governors, knowing they have full imperial backing and won't be second-guessed by the central government, respond more quickly and creatively than might have been possible under closer imperial supervision. Military commanders coordinate effectively with civilian authorities because they're not waiting for detailed instructions from the capital. Local communities organize mutual aid efforts because they know the imperial government trusts their initiative. Within months, what initially appeared to be a crisis that might threaten dynastic stability becomes instead a demonstration of the empire's institutional strength and resilience. The emperor's refusal to micromanage the response has allowed the empire's administrative and social systems to function at their highest level of effectiveness. You witness the long-term results of Zhengde's approach to governance as his reign matures. The empire experiences a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity, not despite his unconventional leadership style, but because of it. Economic growth accelerates as merchants and farmers, confident in stable policies and minimal governmental interference, make long-term investments in productivity and trade. Administrative efficiency improves as officials, unable to rely on constant imperial guidance, develop better systems and procedures for handling routine business. Most remarkably, the quality of governance actually improves throughout the imperial system. Provincial officials, knowing they must take full responsibility for their decisions, become more thoughtful and competent in their administration. Military commanders, unable to blame poor outcomes on inadequate instructions from the capital, develop better strategic thinking and more effective leadership skills. Even minor bureaucrats throughout the empire find themselves rising to higher levels of performance when they realize that competence, rather than political connections or imperial favor, determines their success. You observe the fascinating phenomenon of what historians will later call competence cascade. The way that Zhengde's hands-off approach forces everyone in the governmental system to to become better at their jobs. When officials can't rely on detailed instructions from above, they must develop their own expertise. When they can't blame failures on imperial interference, they must take ownership of results. When they know they have genuine authority to make decisions, they invest more effort in making good ones. The emperor's court becomes a destination for scholars and officials from across the known world. Not because of Zheng Di's personal brilliance or charismatic leadership, but because of the empire's reputation for effective and stable governance. Foreign diplomats report back to their own rulers about the mysterious Chinese system where the emperor seems to do very little, yet everything functions remarkably well. You witness a particularly revealing conversation between Zheng Di and a Venetian merchant who has traveled the Silk Road to establish trade relationships with the Chinese Empire. The merchant, accustomed to European courts where rulers involve themselves in every detail of commercial policy, is initially confused by the emperor's minimal participation in trade negotiations. "Your Majesty," the merchant says, "in my country rulers spend considerable time reviewing trade agreements and setting commercial policies, yet you seem to delegate such matters entirely to your ministers. May I ask why you take so little direct interest in commerce?" Zheng Di's response, delivered with characteristic brevity, reveals the philosophical depth behind his approach. A gardener who constantly digs up his plants to examine their roots will have no harvest. Commerce, like plants, grows best when provided with good conditions and then left alone to flourish. The merchant later writes to his partners in Venice that this brief exchange taught him more about effective economic policy than years of studying European commercial law. He describes the Chinese Empire as a place where trade flourishes precisely because the government provides stability and predictability without constant interference. You follow the emperor through his relationship with the imperial family, observing how his governance philosophy extends to his role as a father and husband. Traditional Chinese imperial culture expected the emperor to take an active role in arranging marriages for his children, planning their education in detail, and preparing them for their future responsibilities through constant instruction and supervision. But Zheng Di applies the same principles of beneficial neglect to family relationships that he uses in governing the empire. His children receive excellent educations from qualified tutors, but he avoids the micromanagement that can stifle their development of independent judgment. His empress manages most household affairs with minimal interference, creating a domestic environment that mirrors the collaborative approach he takes to imperial administration. You witness a touching scene when Zheng Di's eldest son reaches the age where traditional emperors would begin intensive preparation for eventual succession to the throne. Instead of subjecting the boy to endless lectures about imperial responsibility and detailed instruction in governmental procedures, Zheng Di takes a characteristically different approach. "Watch how the empire works," he tells his son. "Notice what makes people happy and what causes problems. Learn to tell the difference between issues that require immediate attention and those that can wait. Most importantly, understand that an emperor's job is to help other people do their jobs well, not to do everyone's job himself." This conversation, brief as it is, provides the young prince with a framework for understanding leadership that will serve him far better than memorizing administrative procedures or mastering ceremonial protocols. The emperor's approach to preparing his successor reflects the same wisdom that governs his approach to managing the empire, providing clear principles and good examples while allowing natural development to proceed without excessive interference. You observe the seasonal rhythms of palace life under Zhengdi's influence, noticing how the entire court has adapted to a more natural and sustainable pace of activity. The traditional Chinese imperial calendar was packed with ceremonies, audiences, and administrative sessions that could exhaust even the most energetic ruler. But Zhengdi's preferences have gradually transformed palace life toward a rhythm that accommodates human limitations while maintaining governmental effectiveness. Spring in the palace becomes a time of renewal and planning, with the emperor participating in just enough ceremonial activities to provide legitimacy while avoiding the exhaustion that can come from overscheduling. The famous spring planting ceremonies, traditionally elaborate affairs lasting several days, are streamlined to focus on their most meaningful elements. Zhengdi's presence at key moments provides the imperial blessing that agricultural communities expect, while his absence from routine aspects allows the ceremonies to focus on their spiritual and practical purposes. Summer brings the challenge of managing the empire during the season of heaviest administrative activity. Tax collection, military campaigns, and major construction projects all typically peak during the summer months. But rather than trying to oversee all these activities personally, Zhengdi has developed what his advisors privately call strategic seasonal delegation. You watch as he establishes clear priorities for the summer season during brief morning consultations with his senior ministers, rather than attempting to manage multiple complex projects simultaneously. He identifies the most critical objectives and ensures that qualified people have the authority and resources they need to achieve them. His role becomes primarily supportive, removing obstacles, providing resources, and offering encouragement rather than directive. The autumn tribute season reveals perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Zhengdi's approach to ceremonial leadership. This is traditionally the most demanding time for imperial participation, with delegations from across the empire and beyond arriving to pay their respects and conduct diplomatic business. The ceremonies associated with tribute reception are among the most complex and important in the imperial calendar. But Zhengdi has managed to maintain the dignity and effectiveness of these ceremonies while minimizing the demands they place on his limited energy and attention. He appears at the most important tribute receptions, providing the imperial presence that legitimizes these diplomatic occasions, but he delegates most routine audiences to qualified officials, reserving his personal participation for encounters that genuinely require imperial attention. You witness a particularly skillful example of this approach when the tribute delegation from the Rikyu Kingdom arrives with a complex proposal for expanded trade relationships. In a traditional court, such negotiations might require the emperor to participate in lengthy discussions about trade routes, commercial regulations, and diplomatic protocols. Instead, Zhengdi receives the delegation with appropriate ceremony, listens to their formal presentation with respectful attention, and then responds with characteristic conciseness. The empire values friendship with the Ryukyu people. Work with my ministers to arrange trade that benefits both our peoples. And remember that honest dealing creates lasting relationships. The delegation, initially surprised by the brevity of the imperial response, gradually realizes that the emperor has actually provided them with the most important guidance they need. His ministers, working within this framework, are able to negotiate agreements that serve both Chinese and Ryukyuan interests, precisely because they're not constrained by overly detailed imperial instructions. Winter palace life, under Zhengdi's influence, becomes a model of sustainable leadership practices. rather than trying to maintain the same level of activity throughout the year. The emperor uses the quieter winter months for reflection planning and the kind of informal consultation that allows him to stay informed about imperial affairs without being overwhelmed by administrative details. You observe the emperor's winter routine, which has evolved into a sophisticated system for maintaining awareness of governmental affairs while conserving the energy needed for more demanding seasons. Morning briefings become even more concise, focusing on only the most essential information. Afternoon activities shift toward the kind of contemplative observation that allows him to understand palace life without actively managing it. Evening consultations during winter months take on a particularly intimate character, with small groups of trusted advisors gathering in the emperor's private quarters for informal discussions about long-term policy directions. These conversations, conducted in the relaxed atmosphere of shared meals and entertainment, often produce insights that might never emerge from formal policy sessions. You witness one such winter evening conversation that proves particularly illuminating about Zhengde's understanding of his role as emperor. A senior advisor asks him directly about his unconventional approach to leadership, wondering whether he ever worries that his minimal involvement in day-to-day governance might be perceived as imperial neglect. Zhengde's response, delivered with unusual directness, reveals the philosophical sophistication behind his approach. An emperor who tries to make every decision himself will make most of them poorly, because no single person can understand every situation the empire faces. But an emperor who chooses good people and gives them clear guidance can benefit from the wisdom of many minds. My job is not to be the smartest person in the empire, but to create conditions where the smartest people can do their best work. This conversation, recorded by one of the participants, provides perhaps the clearest insight into Zhengde's leadership philosophy. He understands that effective governance in a large and complex empire requires distributed intelligence and decision-making. His apparent laziness is actually a sophisticated recognition of the limitations of centralized control. You follow the emperor's handling of what proves to be the most significant diplomatic challenge of his reign, the arrival of European traders and missionaries who bring not only new commercial opportunities, but also religious and cultural ideas that could potentially destabilize traditional Chinese society. The appearance of these foreigners, with their strange customs and unfamiliar technologies, creates exactly the kind of complex situation that might seem to require detailed imperial attention and careful management. The traditional imperial response to such a challenge might involve lengthy consultations with Confucian scholars about the implications of foreign influence, detailed regulations about contact between Chinese subjects and foreign visitors, and probably extensive imperial pronouncements about maintaining cultural purity and traditional values. But Zhengde's approach characteristically focuses on principles rather than detailed regulations. Welcome those who come in peace and good faith. Learn what they have to teach, but remember that our own traditions have served the empire well for thousands of years. This guidance, brief as it is, provides his officials with a framework for managing foreign contact that proves remarkably effective, rather than automatically rejecting foreign ideas or uncritically accepting them. Imperial administrators develop policies that allow for beneficial cultural exchange while maintaining social stability. European technologies that can improve Chinese agriculture and manufacturing are welcomed, while religious ideas are allowed to exist alongside traditional beliefs without creating conflict. The results exceed what anyone might have expected from more detailed imperial management of foreign relations. Chinese scholars engage in productive exchanges with European visitors, learning about developments in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering, while sharing their own advances in these fields. Trade relationships develop that benefit both Chinese merchants and European partners, creating economic opportunities without disrupting traditional commercial patterns. Most remarkably, the cultural exchange occurs without the social upheaval that such contact might have produced under different leadership. Zhengde's approach, welcoming beneficial influences while maintaining confidence in Chinese traditions, creates an environment where foreign ideas can be evaluated on their merits, rather than being automatically accepted or rejected based on their origins. You observe the emperor's approach to what might be called the technology of laziness, the systems and procedures he develops to minimize the effort required for effective leadership while maximizing its impact. These innovations, born from his natural inclination to avoid unnecessary work, prove to have broader applications for governmental efficiency. The imperial briefing system evolves under Zhengde's influence into a model of concise communication that eliminates redundancy and focuses attention on essential information. Officials learn to distill complex situations into brief summaries that provide the emperor with the information he needs to make broad policy decisions without overwhelming him with details he doesn't need to know. The palace develops what becomes known as the color-coded priority system for managing the flow of information to the emperor. Routine administrative matters are handled entirely by qualified officials without imperial involvement. Issues requiring imperial awareness but not immediate action are summarized in brief reports that the emperor reviews during his morning briefings. Only truly critical matters that require immediate imperial attention are presented for direct decision-making. This system, designed initially to accommodate Zhengde's limited attention span, proves so effective that it continues to be used by later emperors who don't share his inclination toward minimal involvement in governmental details. The principles behind the system, distinguishing between information and decision-making needs, eliminating unnecessary communication, and focusing high-level attention on genuinely important matters, become standard practices in Chinese imperial administration. You witness the development of what palace historians call ambient governance, Zhegan's technique for staying informed about imperial affairs and influencing policy directions without engaging in formal administrative processes. Rather than relying primarily on official reports and formal meetings, the emperor gathers information through casual conversations, observation of palace life, and informal consultations with people at various levels of the governmental hierarchy. This approach proves remarkably effective at providing the emperor with accurate information about how policies are actually working, as opposed to how they're supposed to work according to official reports. Servants, artisans, and minor officials who might never have access to formal imperial audiences often provide insights about the real-world effects of governmental decisions that don't appear in bureaucratic summaries. You observe a particularly telling example when changes in tax collection procedures create unexpected hardships for small merchants in the capital. The official reports to the emperor describe the new procedures as more efficient and fair, with improved revenue collection and reduced administrative costs. But through his informal conversations with palace suppliers and craftsmen, Zhengde learns that the practical effects of the changes are creating serious problems for small businesses. Rather than ordering a formal investigation, or demanding detailed reports about the situation. The emperor's response is characteristically indirect but effective. During a casual conversation with his senior revenue minister, he mentions that he's been hearing concerns about how recent changes are affecting small merchants, and wonders whether there might be ways to achieve the benefits of the new procedures without creating unintended hardships. This casual mention, delivered without formal authority or specific instructions, nevertheless prompts the minister to investigate the situation more carefully. Within weeks, the revenue procedures are modified to address the problems affecting small merchants while maintaining the efficiency gains that made the changes worthwhile in the first place. The emperor's minimal intervention has solved a significant problem without requiring formal administrative processes or detailed imperial involvement. You follow the emperor through his relationship with the imperial bureaucracy, observing how his approach to personnel management reflects the same principles that govern his approach to policymaking. Traditional Chinese imperial practice involved detailed imperial oversight of official appointments, with the emperor personally reviewing candidates for important positions and making decisions based on formal qualifications and political considerations. But Zhengde has developed what might be called delegated meritocracy, a system where qualified senior officials are given authority to make most personnel decisions within broad guidelines about the qualities and qualifications the emperor considers important. Rather than trying to evaluate individual candidates personally, he focuses on ensuring that the people making personnel decisions understand his priorities and have the judgment to implement them effectively. His guidance to officials responsible for personnel decisions reflects his characteristic combination of clarity and brevity. Choose people who can think for themselves, work well with others, and care more about getting good results than about getting credit for them. Avoid people who need constant supervision or who create problems for their colleagues. This guidance, simple as it appears, actually provides a sophisticated framework for personnel selection that proves remarkably effective at identifying capable administrators and leaders. Officials selected according to these criteria tend to be exactly the kind of people who can function effectively in Zhengde's decentralized system of governance. You witness the long-term results of this approach to personnel management as the emperor's reign progresses. The imperial bureaucracy gradually fills with officials who share his preference for competence over politics, for collaboration over competition, and for results over process. These officials in turn select subordinates who reflect similar values, creating what amounts to a cultural transformation in imperial administration. The quality of governmental decision-making improves throughout the system as officials who can think for themselves develop better policies than those who simply follow detailed instructions from above. Administrative efficiency increases as people who work well with others create more collaborative and effective working relationships. Public satisfaction with governmental services grows as officials who care more about getting good results than getting credit focus their attention on actually solving problems rather than on political maneuvering. You observe the emperor's handling of what proves to be one of the most challenging aspects of Chinese imperial leadership, managing the complex relationships between different factions and interest groups within the court and throughout the empire. Traditional imperial practice typically required the emperor to carefully balance competing interests, often through detailed involvement in factional politics and strategic distribution of imperial favor. But Zhengde's approach to factional management reflects his broader philosophy of governance through principled delegation rather than detailed control. Instead of trying to manage factional relationships personally, he establishes clear standards for acceptable behavior and allows competing groups to work out their differences within those parameters. His approach to factional conflict is revealed during a particularly serious dispute between conservative Confucian scholars who want to maintain traditional policies and reform-minded officials who advocate for significant changes in administrative procedures. Such disputes have historically been sources of serious instability in Chinese imperial courts, sometimes leading to purges, exile, and even rebellion. Instead of taking sides in the dispute or trying to impose a compromise solution, Zheng Di's response focuses on process rather than outcome. Both tradition and innovation serve the empire when guided by wisdom and good faith. Present your ideas respectfully, listen to each other carefully, and find solutions that serve the people's welfare rather than your own preferences. This guidance, delivered to leaders of both factions, establishes ground rules for constructive disagreement while avoiding the kind of imperial intervention that might create winners and losers. The result is a series of productive discussions that actually improve the quality of decision-making by forcing both sides to articulate their positions clearly and to address legitimate concerns raised by their opponents. The factional dispute, rather than creating instability, becomes an opportunity for institutional learning and improvement. Conservative scholars, forced to defend traditional practices, develop better explanations for why certain approaches have proven effective over time. Reform advocates, required to address concerns about unintended consequences, develop more thoughtful and careful proposals for change. Most importantly, the process creates a model for managing future disagreements that doesn't require constant imperial intervention. Court officials learn that factional differences can be productive when managed according to clear principles of respectful discourse and genuine concern for public welfare. You witness the emperor's approach to crisis management through his handling of what initially appears to be a serious threat to imperial authority. A provincial governor, emboldened by the emperor's hands-off approach to administration, begins making decisions that exceed his legitimate authority and creates conflicts with neighboring provinces. The traditional imperial response to such a challenge might involve immediate removal of the offending official, possibly followed by investigation and punishment of his associates. Such decisive action would demonstrate imperial authority while deterring similar behavior by other officials. But Zheng Di's response characteristically seeks to address the underlying problem rather than simply punishing the symptom. He sends a trusted advisor to meet privately with the governor, not to deliver threats or ultimatums, but to understand why the official feels it necessary to exceed his authority and to explore whether legitimate concerns might be addressed through proper channels. The investigation reveals that the governor's excessive actions stem from frustration with bureaucratic procedures that prevent him from responding effectively to genuine problems in his province. Rather than simply being power-hungry or disloyal, he's been trying to serve his people more effectively than existing procedures allow. The emperor's response to this discovery reflects his sophisticated understanding of administrative psychology. Instead of punishing the governor, he works with senior officials to modify the procedures that created the problem in the first place. The governor's authority is clarified and somewhat expanded within appropriate limits, while new communication channels are established to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. The result is not only resolution of the immediate crisis, but improvement of the administrative system that prevents similar problems from arising elsewhere. Other provincial officials, seeing that legitimate concerns about procedural obstacles are addressed constructively, become more likely to work within the system rather than trying to circumvent it. You observe how Zhengdi's approach to leadership creates what might be called sustainable governance, a system that can function effectively over long periods without exhausting the people who operate it. Traditional Chinese imperial administration often burned out capable officials through excessive demands and constant pressure for perfect performance. But the emperor's recognition of human limitations and his focus on creating supportive working conditions actually improve long-term governmental effectiveness. Officials working under Zhengdi's system report higher job satisfaction and greater sense of professional accomplishment than their counterparts in more demanding imperial courts. They have the authority needed to do their jobs effectively, the support required when they encounter problems, and the recognition that comes from achieving real results rather than simply following procedures. This improved working environment attracts and retains better officials, creating a positive cycle where governmental competence continually improves. Capable people want to work in a system where their abilities are valued and their judgment is trusted. Once in the system, they tend to stay because they can achieve more meaningful accomplishments than would be possible in more restrictive environments. You witness the emperor's approach to public communication, observing how his minimal direct involvement in governmental publicity actually enhances rather than diminishes imperial prestige. Traditional Chinese emperors typically issued frequent proclamations, gave regular speeches about policy directions, and maintained high public visibility as a way of demonstrating active leadership. But Zhengdi has discovered that occasional, carefully chosen public communications can have more impact than constant imperial commentary. When he does speak publicly, his words carry special weight precisely because they're relatively rare. His brief statements about important issues become topics of extended discussion and analysis, with people paying close attention to subtle implications that might be overlooked in more frequent imperial communications. You observe a particularly effective example of this approach during a period of economic uncertainty, when rumors about potential policy changes are creating anxiety among merchants and farmers. Rather than issuing detailed explanations of economic policy or frequent reassurances about governmental intentions, Zhengdi makes a brief public statement that quickly restores confidence. The empire's prosperity depends on the hard work and honest dealing of its people. Governmental policies will continue to reward both. This simple statement, delivered during a routine ceremonial appearance, provides exactly the reassurance that economic communities need, without committing the government to specific policies that might prove inappropriate as conditions change. Merchants and farmers, confident that their efforts will continue to be supported, resume normal business activities. The economic uncertainty dissolves without requiring detailed governmental intervention or complex policy adjustments. The emperor's communication strategy proves particularly effective because it allows other people to provide the detailed explanations and specific guidance that different constituencies need. His brief statement of principles creates a framework within which his advisors can develop more specific policies, while his minimal direct involvement prevents imperial authority from being undermined by the inevitable controversies that surround detailed policy discussions. You follow the emperor through his final years, observing how his approach to leadership continues to evolve and mature. Rather than becoming more controlling as he gains experience, he becomes even more skillful at identifying what genuinely requires his attention and what can be effectively handled by others. His delegation becomes more sophisticated, his communication more precise, and his interventions more strategic. The empire during these later years of Zhengdi's reign achieves a level of stability and prosperity that impresses contemporary observers and will be remembered by historians as one of the golden periods of Chinese civilization. Economic growth continues at sustainable rates. Social harmony is maintained despite the pressures of change and development, and governmental efficiency reaches levels that won't be matched for centuries. Most remarkably, this golden age is achieved not through heroic imperial leadership or brilliant policy innovations, but through the consistent application of principles that recognize human limitations while creating conditions for human capabilities to flourish. Zhengdi's laziness proves to be a form of wisdom that later leaders will struggle to understand and emulate. You witness the emperor's preparation for succession, observing how his approach to training his heir reflects the same principles that have guided his approach to governance. Rather than overwhelming his son with detailed instructions about imperial responsibilities, he focuses on helping the young man develop the judgment and character needed to continue the successful patterns of leadership. The conversations between father and son during this transition period reveal the depth of wisdom behind Zhengdi's seemingly casual approach to rule. The hardest part of being emperor, he tells his heir, is not making decisions, but knowing which decisions you need to make yourself and which ones you should leave to other people. Most problems solve themselves if you give them time and don't make them worse through unnecessary interference. This guidance, simple as it sounds, encapsulates lessons that it has taken Zhengdi decades to learn. His son, equipped with these insights from the beginning of his reign, will be able to build on his father's achievements while adapting the basic principles to the different challenges of his own era. You observe the final scene of Zhengdi's remarkable reign as the aging emperor spends his last days in the same peaceful state that has characterized his entire approach to leadership. Even facing the end of his life, he maintains the same serene confidence in the people and systems he has carefully nurtured over decades of seemingly effortless rule. His final words, delivered to his assembled advisors and family members, provide a perfect summary of his leadership philosophy. The empire was great before I was born, and it will be great after I am gone. Our job is not to make ourselves indispensable, but to make ourselves unnecessary by helping others become capable of excellence. As you drift away from this remarkable story of the laziest emperor in Chinese history, you carry with you the paradoxical lesson that sometimes the most effective form of leadership is knowing when not to lead, when to step back and allow the wisdom and capability of others to flourish. In a world that often celebrates busy, hands-on management and visible decision-making, Zhengdi's reign stands as a testament to the power of strategic restraint, thoughtful delegation, and the kind of confidence in others that creates space for excellence to emerge. The gentle rhythm of palace life continues in your mind, the soft shuffle of silk slippers on marble floors, the distant chime of temple bells, the whispered consultations of capable advisors managing an empire while their emperor sleeps peacefully, dreaming perhaps of the perfect balance between authority and wisdom, between power and restraint, between doing everything and doing just enough. And in that peaceful image, you find yourself drifting toward your own rest, carried by the knowledge that sometimes the greatest achievements come not from constant effort, but from the wisdom to know when effort is needed and when it's better to simply trust in the natural order of things, allowing life to unfold with the same gentle confidence that made a lazy emperor into one of history's most successful rulers. The silk curtains of the Forbidden City flutter one last time in your imagination, carrying with them the whispered secrets of how an emperor turned sleeping into statecraft and made an art form out of strategic absence. Who would have thought that the key to ruling 60 million people was mastering the perfect nap and knowing when not to show up to your own meetings? If you enjoyed this ride, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss what's coming next. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did Zheng De's approach to leadership surprise you? And as always, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Until next time, keep your curiosity alive and your nights filled with wonder.